Chapter 7 Dark Magic. "I don't want to leave you," Vale cried in an angry tone within their mental bond. She wore a pout upon her face that somehow made her completely desirable. Jacen looked back at her expression, then chuckled. She felt his mirth at her expression, and she became even more petulant with her hands on her hips, which made him laugh harder. Suddenly, she unexpectedly changed her face into a hideous monster, and she roared at him in a deep and demonic voice. He jumped to his feet and cried out, and suddenly her face was back to its usual sexy form, and she now wore a small smile upon her mouth. Jacen felt her laughter within his mind, and he calmed down. He had never seen her make that demonic face before, and realized it was somehow based on his own subconscious fears that she could access due to their unusual mental bond. He approached her slowly, and her expression changed to one of chagrin. She had not meant to frighten him, and he could feel her momentary remorse. He held open his arms, and she ran into them, almost knocking him over. He squeezed her tight, and she began to kiss at his mouth and pull at the strings of his trousers. Jacen felt her lust for him building, but gently stopped her hands and held them within his own. She was breathing hard and looked up at him with a surprised pause. "We need to practice this, my love. I want you to do it for me," he intoned within their minds. She dropped her hands and looked away. It would be the first time they would be separated for any great length of time since he had manifested her, and he could feel her trepidation. After a time, she relented, and they began planning out their day. They stood within the great forest on the outskirts of a large village they had come across the night before. Jacen had not been to a village for almost a year and wanted to exchange the large sacks of jewels and coins that Vale had brought to him over the many months they had been together. He reflected upon how happy he had been with her traveling and camping within the forest together, keeping away from others entirely during that time. Except for the forest brigands they infrequently encountered, they had not visited any towns or villages, and soon Vale's gifts had become too cumbersome to hike with. Jacen looked at the too large bag of gifts she had given him, and remembered discovering how she had come about them. One day he had awakened in the early morning hours, and Vale was not there. He was not frightened, for he could still feel her within his mind a short distance away, and he decided not to call out to her within his mind, and instead got up and went to look for her. Following her direction within his mind, he had soon come to overlook another campsite where several merchants were camping. He could not see Vale, but could feel her within the group, and knew she was using her hidden form as she moved among the many men that slept or walked around the campfire. Jacen had learned that if he closed his eyes and concentrated, he could see what she saw. He closed his eyes to use the technique, and soon he saw the view through her eyes. He gasped as he realized she stood within the very midst of the many men, but was not seen by them. With consternation, he watched as she went through their bags of goods and took coins and other goods. "Vale, come back to me this instant," he commanded. He felt her give a little mental yelp, but then felt her acknowledgement. Jacen walked back to his own campsite, and Vale soon returned, carrying a small bag of coins she had taken. As she placed the small bag of coins on the ground by his feet, she had mentally uttered, "My love, I thought you still slept." She had formed her face into one she knew he liked the most, a version with full pouty lips, darker shoulder-length hair with shapely eyebrows. Jacen looked at her and would not be swayed by the desire he felt pressing against him as she lightly licked her mouth. "Vale, I love all the gifts you have given me, but I do not want you to steal from other people unless I command it. Do you understand me?" he said to her within his mind. Her face returned to its standard form, and she pouted and looked away, but mentally responded, "I understand, my love." He grinned and walked over to her and gently placed his arms around her. She turned to look at him with a small defiant expression on her cute face. "Kiss me," he verbally commanded. Instantly she wrapped her arms around his neck in the way he liked and kissed him long and hard with her body pliant against his own. Soon they were laying down upon the ground with their naked forms intertwined. Jacen was brought out of the memory, and a small grin came to his mouth. She had stopped giving him the gifts, but occasionally he would still find some shiny trinket next to him when he would awaken. He returned his attention to their activity. "Change your form to match the dress of the matrons you see," he commanded within his mind. As he watched, Vale's form quickly changed, and she suddenly looked like a middle-aged woman wearing the dark general wraps that women in the most villages would wear. "Approach the village from the western entrance, and walk through the market as if you are shopping," came his next command. Vel sent him a little sound within his mind, which he had come to know as her blowing him a kiss, and set off for the village. As she walked away at a slow pace that would match that of an older woman, Jacen slipped back into the trees and sat down on a stump of rock. He closed his eyes and took several deep breaths of the forest air and cleared his mind. He could feel Vel moving away from him within his mind, and he sought to see through her eyes. After a moment had passed, he connected with her and saw through her gaze. It was as if he looked upon a large screen that appeared within his mind, and he could see what she looked at. The lines of the mental screen were slightly blurred as Jacen watched his lover walk toward the entrance to the village. Several people passed by her and gave her the traditional bow of greeting. "Return their greetings every time, my love," Jacen mentally commanded, and he saw Vel's mental view begin to return the greetings as to those she passed by. Vel mentally giggled as they passed by the different marketplace dwellers. Jacen grinned as she said, "They don't even suspect a thing." Vel walked around for some time, then Jacen ordered her to return. Working together, Vel carried one of the bags of goods and Jacen the other. They carefully made their way back to the market and found a trader willing to exchange their coin and jewelry for a larger denomination of gold and silver that would be easier to transport. With Vel in disguise at his arm, Jacen worked out a percentage for the trader and received a leather pouch with the agreed-upon gold and silver coin. The pouch was still heavy, but more manageable, and they left the trader to peruse a nearby mercantile stall. Several children approached the two and begged for food, and Jacen gave Vel a gold coin and mentally ordered her to purchase them all some fruit and bread from a nearby baker's stall. "Come along, children. Grandmother will feed you today," Vel said in an older woman's voice, and the relieved children left with her as she moved away. Looking at the items sold at the mercantile, Jacen purchased a new travel bag that would better accommodate their coin and traded the articles of clothing that Vel had stolen for credit within the store. He used most of the credit to fill his new pack with travel rations and purchased a new heavy blanket for he and Vel to lay upon. As he paid for his wares, he noticed the shop owner grin and nod as he gave Jacen his change, and the young man wondered at the change that had come over himself since he had been with Vel. He felt her return and noticed she had a gleam in her eye as the children ate their fill behind her. They trailed next to her as if she were a queen in their midst, and Jacen grinned as he saw her effect upon them. "Children, you have found luck today," Jacen said, and he gave each of the children one of the rations he had purchased along with a silver coin. The children each said, "Thank you, good sir," in a weak manner, and Jacen patted each of them upon their heads. He felt Vel standing beside him, and as he turned away from the final child, she stepped in and kissed him hard and passionately upon his mouth. Jacen inwardly laughed as she kissed him, and he felt her laughter also. They broke the kiss and looked around them to see all the patrons within the store staring at them. Jacen looked at Vel and she at him, and they laughed together at the same time and left the store behind them. Soon they had found themselves back in the forest. Vel began to change her form, but Jacen mentally commanded her, "No, I want that form." Vel turned toward him with a surprised look upon her face, then shaped herself back into the matronly woman. Jacen approached her and grabbed her by the shoulders and kissed her passionately. Vel returned his fervor, and soon her matronly naked form lay upon the ground and looked up at Jacen as he struggled to pull off his clothing. Soon he was intertwined with her form, and each achieved a strong orgasm with the other at the same time. Vel's form gradually returned to her standard appearance, and she lay contentedly within Jacen's powerful arms. "Why are we doing this again?" Vel asked within his mind. "He was like a father to me, and I want to find out where he went and make sure he is okay," Jacen mentally explained for the 100th time. I see. But it just seems like there are many things you could do, like maybe settle down, start a mercantile, travel the known world," thought Vel. "Look, my love, I want to do all of that with you, and more, but we can do all of that while still looking for him. Please help me," he thought to her. "Of course I will, my love. I will go with you everywhere," she responded aloud. They had been walking along the main path of the great forest for several weeks, stopping at the villages along the way and continuing Jacen's original quest to find his master. Jacen reflected on all that had changed since the last time he had seen his mentor at their farm, and felt an internal drive born of familial love to make sure the man was okay. He had not thought about his master for some time since being with Vel, and he found the desire to find the man return anew. Sharing his feelings with Vel about it, she had seemed willing to follow him wherever he went. As they walked, Vel suddenly gave him a mental alert, and he looked in the direction she intoned within their minds. Walking toward them was a group of 10 men, all wearing forest armor and carrying bows and short swords. Jacen reached up and slid out his master's stave weapon and harmonized his will to the device. The weapon began humming in an arcane way. Without looking at her, Jacen felt Vel blend into the trees in near invisibility while simultaneously transforming her hands and tail into jagged weapons. The 10 men began running in Jacen's direction, and 2 of them came to a knee and launched several missiles at him. Jacen reacted quickly and blocked several of the projectiles out of his path while leaping to safety. The brigands stopped firing, and Jacen was suddenly surrounded by 8 of the men who had pulled out their short swords. Several of them moved in to cut at Jacen, who spun in several directions and blocked their attacks. Each time his staff struck their swords, there was the sound of an electrical discharge. Several of the metallic weapons went flying backwards to strike their own attackers, causing great cuts to appear in their faces, arms, and torsos. Jacen began striking at the brigands' unprotected flanks, and soon several of the men were lying on the ground grabbing at their wounds he had caused. Suddenly, 2 of the warriors were attacked from some unseen force behind their backs and became wounded with jagged cuts appearing on their unprotected forms. Vel appeared from out of the darkness and began screaming and roaring in a demonic voice. He and Vel worked together, and soon all the brigands were lying on the ground, incapacitated. Just then, an arrow came flying from somewhere outside of their area and struck Vel in the shoulder. The missile did not penetrate her skin, but bounced off with a loud thud of impact. Vel cried out and staggered forward. Jacen turned to her and sharply cried out, "Vel!" He ran over to her, dropped his staff, and grabbed her by her arms. He had felt her pain within his mind when she had gotten struck by the missile. Vel grabbed him back and leaned on him as she mentally said, "I am okay." Jacen turned and looked in the direction the missile had come from. One of the remaining brigands was just loading up one of his other missiles and taking aim. Jacen pushed Vel out of the way and swept up of his weapon as he roared out a battle cry and launched himself toward the man in a sprint. The man released his arrow, but Jacen batted it out of the air with his vibrating staff. The man watched Jacen strike his arrow and stood up to run away. Jacen slid to a stop and took aim at the fleeing figure. He launched his staff through the air, and it plunged home directly on target through the man's upper torso. The man fell to the earth and slid to a stop where he lay unmoving. Jacen ran up to the man and pulled his weapon from the wound. He turned around quickly and saw Vel walking amongst the fallen brigands and was using her jagged-shaped hands to stab into their forms to ensure death. Jacen ran over to her, and she fell into his arms. They held each other for some time, then stood up and left the dead men piled on the side of the road. After verifying she was okay, Jacen left Vel to search the bodies and bring him anything of value while he scouted up the road. As she began to perform the duty, Jacen lightly jogged up the road and away from her. The path was clear, and soon Vel rejoined him carrying a small sack of goods she had made from one of the fallen men's tunics. They pressed on down the path and continued their trek on their joint mission to find Jacen's lost master. "Concentrate, my love, you can do this," came Vel within his mind. Jacen took a deep breath, then concentrated on the clearing within the forest near him. He listened for Vel's words within his mind as she sat next to him and spoke the words she said. Speaking together, Jacen spoke the words aloud that she said within his mind as she stared at the clearing.
Duverius, Duverius, concurium Duverius.
Duverius, Duverius, concurium Duverius, he intoned. A small gust of wind began blowing through the clearing. "Now, my love," came Vel's command, and he said it aloud, "Concurium!" The wind began building and quickly reached to a howling noise. Jacen felt his control come over the wind, and he directed it to blow in various directions. He stood up and saw Vel clap her hands and jump up and down, laughing. "Excellent, you have done it, my love," she said triumphantly within his mind. The wind blew all around the two, whipping their hair and clothes about. Jacen continued to play with the wind and tried out several combinations of directed will. After several minutes of experimentation, he said the word of command one final time, and the wind died down at his direction. "You did it, lover!" Vel exclaimed in his mind and ran over to kiss him. She gave him a long and deep lover's kiss. "That was exhilarating," he said aloud and looked at her with a smile. Just then, a crackling noise came from the direction of the clearing. Jacen and Vel both turned to see several dark shapes outlined in red coming toward them. The area around the two became dark, and the creature's whispers were loud and overwhelming. Vel shaped her hands and tail into weapons with a snarl. Jacen bent over and grabbed his head, then suddenly stood up and shouted, "Concurium!" His voice rang out with strong vibrational emanations, and instantly everything became silent. One by one, the dark shapes left the area, and Vel stared at her lover in amazement. Jacen looked at her as the last dark shape left and the natural light of the forest returned. "Now that was exhilarating," he said with a grin. Vel shook her head and grinned back at him. The tavern was loud and boisterous, and Jacen concentrated on the dice throw ahead of him. Many people were shoved in close to him and waited with bated breath at his next throw. At a momentary lull in their travels, he had gotten uncommonly drunk and had gambled nearly all their coin away. This last throw was for a bet he had made without the ability to pay if he lost, but would return nearly everything he had already lost if he won. Vel stood near him, shaped into the form of a traveling merchant. She watched back and gave him an all-clear signal within their private mental connection. Jacen looked through a drunken haze and tried to concentrate on the game board he stood above. He saw double of everything, and the room started spinning dangerously as the noise pressed against him. Struggling to maintain his balance, he threw the dice onto the board. The two bone pieces danced here and there and came to rest, showing a single dot on each face. "Double eyes, you lose!" cried the game master, and Jacen bent over and threw up to the side. Everyone backed away from the filth and stench, and Jacen turned and wobbled away from the table, with Vel in close pursuit. Jacen weaved left and right, trying to avoid the many game tables, and Vel cried out a mental warning as two game collectors began running at Jacen's wobbling form. He turned and made a grab at his spear weapon, but could not locate it within his drunken state, and turned away as the men came within reach. Just then Vel roared, and her hands formed into daggers which she swiped at the men running toward her lover. One of the men's head was cut clean off and rolled across the floor, while his headless body fell forward and began pouring blood onto the floor of the tavern. The other man was deeply impaled and screamed as Vel's weapon plunged into his gut. Pandemonium broke out, and Vel backed away from the group of running men who poured out of the windows, trying to escape the wicked creature that walked among them. She and Jacen were finally able to make their way to the outside and began running in the dark toward the tree line of the forest and away from the small town they had come across in their travels. Soon they were both within the trees, and Vel allowed her form to return to its natural shape. Jacen stopped and leaned against a tree and retched again. He slid to his rear and weakly reached into his travel pack to pull out his small canteen. Vel stood nearby watching the surrounding trees and alert for danger while her master recovered. As Jacen rummaged through his pack, his eyes fell on the empty coin purse that had recently held a small fortune. With a sinking heart, he realized he could no longer afford their dreams of traveling the world and would have to work for their money once again. Jacen rose to his feet and bent over with a queasy feeling. After some time had passed, he and Vel built a small campfire against an outgrowth of rock where Jacen fell into a troubled sleep. He awoke the next morning with a pounding headache and a dry mouth. Vel had prepared a coney, and he dug into the meal ravenously with a mental word of thanks. She blew him a kiss within his mind and set off to scout about. Jacen sat back after he had finished the meal and drank a mouthful of water. The food helped restore his constitution, and after a time he stood up and began moving slowly through a series of stretches his master had taught him. Vel returned from her scouting with another meal of coney, and they packed up the campsite and returned to the forest in search of the main road. They walked for a time with the sounds of the forest all around them, and after several miles they came to a natural spring. The air was warm, and Jacen stripped off his clothing and slipped into the small pool of water that had formed. Bathing his entire body, he bid Vel join him, and she willed herself naked and walked into the water to join him. Her skin was a creamy shade of light purple, and his dark hands stood out in stark contrast as he caressed her to him within the warm pool. They stood intertwined in this fashion for some time. Then Vel turned around to face him and gently reached out to kiss him upon the mouth. Jacen was surprised at how gentle she kissed him, as he was used to the more forceful lover's embrace. This time she seemed to be offering comfort instead of providing the usual sexual gratification. He held her to him, enjoying the gentleness of her mouth and feeling her body pressed against his so intimately in the water. After a long while, the two lovers stepped from the water, each renewed and ready to continue their adventure, no matter which direction it took them. Later that day, the two found one of the main forest roads and joined the throng of people that walked upon it. Vel had taken on her matronly form and walked alongside Jacen. They arrived at the southern village of Chernoon and walked about the market square that boasted a large interior mercantile. As Jacen and the disguised Vel looked at the posted signs for work, a tall man wearing the armor and weaponry of the Blacked Warriors was calling out and speaking to the groups of men and women that passed by. "The Lord rules these lands with an iron fist. Join that iron fist and become part of our special brotherhood. Who among you would join our special brotherhood?" he said in a powerful, inviting way to those people that were within earshot. Jacen turned and watched as the man continued his speech. "As a mercenary hire, you will be paid well and given training by the great Lord's soldiers. Join today for the upcoming venture to the Eastern Valley," the man boomed out. Jacen approached the man and stood with several other men who had stopped to hear what the man said. "If any of you good men are interested, join our caravan that leaves for the valley tomorrow at dawn," he said, then stepped away and moved down the walkway and away from the mercantile. Jacen watched the man go and mentally conversed with Vel, who stepped up beside him and wondered at this strange turn of events. At dawn the next morning, Jacen and Vel arrived and joined the group of 12 other men that had arrived. Each of the men carried a travel bag and blanket, and several carried old short swords or daggers. One man had a bow and quiver of arrows. Vel had disguised herself as a wiry young man and wore a travel cloak but carried no weapon. Jacen got in line behind the mule-driven train that would lead he and the others to their training center. The armored Blacked Warrior who had spoken the day before was seen speaking to a dozen of his own armored men. After a time, he stood up and addressed the gathered volunteers. "Today you are the Lord's mercenary armory that has been hired to travel into the Eastern Valley. You are charged to help defend the group and will be given an equal share of any spoils taken along the way," he called out. The gathered men murmured to each other appreciatively, and Jacen considered it a good opportunity for an investment that would help him continue his quest for his master. "You will be paid at the end of each week and will be provided 1 meal ration per day. Each man is expected to help hunt for his own food when we set up camp each evening. Let's move out!" the man shouted. The travel train set out, and soon the men were walking behind the mule train. The Blacked Warrior leader rode on a seat in the mule train, and the 12 other armored men walked in a formation in front of the wagon. The volunteers followed up the wagon and provided a rear to the caravan. The group walked for several hours without incident and were soon deep within the eastern forest. Around noon, the leader called a halt and gave orders for the meal rations to be handed out. Jacen gratefully accepted the package that was given to him by one of the armored Blacked Warriors, and he and Vel sat down on the side of the road where he got busy eating the contents of the meal. He discovered a salty dried fish with a gritty travel biscuit which he gobbled up and washed down with a drink of his canteen. Vel pretended to eat but wrapped up her portion and ended up placing it in Jacen's travel pack for another time. She touched Jacen's arm in a gentle way, and Jacen turned and smiled at her. A large, brown-skinned man watched the interaction from nearby and spoke up with bits of his gritty biscuit flying out of his mouth. "So it's like that between you, eh?" he said, then broke into a wheezy-sounding laugh. Jacen glanced at the man, then at Vel in her disguise, and chuckled. Just then, the Blacked Warrior leader cried out and pointed to the nearby forest where the sound of thundering hoofs could be heard traveling in their direction. Jacen sprang up and looked around the forest. Suddenly, a great herd of forest animals was stampeding toward the group. The Black Warriors had just enough time to cry out as several of the large four-legged animals ran toward them. 2 of the Black Warriors were immediately trampled by the running creatures, and one of the volunteers was impaled by the horns of a large bull. His body hung lifeless from the horn of the great creature, and he was dragged away into the sea of moving bodies. Everyone else had taken cover behind the large mule train, and soon the stampede was over, and the large group of animals had moved on. The 2 black warriors had been killed, and the leader gave orders for graves to be prepared. 4 of his remaining troops grabbed pickaxes and shovels from the mule train and pulled the dead bodies to the side of the road, where they covered them with blankets and set to work digging graves. The leader approached the volunteers that were left and addressed the shaken men. "Right! 2 of our men were killed, and we have orders to return their general armor and weapons to our quartermaster. In the meantime, you will arrange amongst yourselves a designated leader and his choice of lieutenants who will be outfitted temporarily for this excursion. Let me know your choice by morning." The volunteers looked at each other and were unsure how to proceed. Finally, a tall and muscular man stepped forward and dropped his pack as he said, "I nominate myself." The brown-skinned man who had spoken before turned to the man and said, "And why should we be following you then?" The tall man stepped over to him, stared at him, then quickly punched him in the stomach. The brown-skinned man doubled over, and Jacen ran over and roughly pushed the tall man away. The man went stumbling into the dirt and scrambled to a kneeling position. Jacen helped the brown-skinned man recover, then turned to the tall man who was standing up and taking off his shirt. The remaining black warriors had gathered to watch the fighting and began placing bets on the outcome. Jacen stepped away from the brown-skinned man, dropped his pack, and pulled off his own tunic. The tall man bellowed a battle cry and charged at Jacen. Jacen leapt forward and began striking the tall man in a series and combination of blows. The tall man blocked the flurry of blows but was soon pummeled and dazed. Jacen leapt back, then darted forward and struck the man expertly on the side of his head with a flying side kick. The man went down to the ground like a sack of bricks and did not move. Jacen landed lightly upon his feet, then stopped his movements as another man dropped his pack and quickly took off his shirt. The new man was smaller than Jacen, but squat and stocky and covered in thick muscle. He came in low at Jacen, who began punching at the man's head but could not daze him. The young fighter was able to keep the man away with him with a series of pushes and kicks, and eventually he found an opening in the man's defense. Jacen kicked him smartly on the thigh, causing the man to cry out in pain and fall to the ground. All the other men were taking off their shirts, and Jacen was starting to breathe heavily. Just then Vel arrived. She was still masked in her disguised form and stood back to back with Jacen. The brown-skinned man had dropped his pack and came to stand with them as well. The rest of the men rushed in, and Jacen and Vel worked perfectly together in their mental connection to combat the strong men. Their area took on the sound of several men fighting with loud battle cries and with the sound of fists and feet striking against muscle and bone. The brown-skinned man defended Jacen's flank and kept him from getting overwhelmed on that side. After a moment of sustained fistfighting, the rest of the men lay upon the ground, repulsed by Jacen and Vel's combined fighting prowess. The brown-skinned man was busy punching a man over and over in the face that he kept in a headlock on the ground. Jacen ran over and tapped him on the shoulder. The man looked up at Jacen and grinned, then released the man he had been holding onto, who promptly fell to the ground. Jacen helped the brown-skinned man up and said, "Thank you for your help, my friend. My name is Jacen, and this is my friend Vel." The brown-skinned man accepted Jacen's help up and responded, "I am Jacinto." The next morning, Jacen stepped up to the black warrior leader as the designated leader of the mercenary volunteers. He was given the 2 sets of black warrior armor and weapons that had come from the dead soldiers. He donned one set of the armor and gave the other to Jacinto. The red dragon emblem of the Black Warrior Legion was etched into the chest piece, and Jacen looked down at the symbol with a curious feeling of belonging. The Black Warrior leader took Jacen and Jacinto aside and spoke to them privately. "I am Captain Porter. For taking on the additional role, you will both be paid an extra stipend each week and will be given consideration for joining the Black Warrior Legion at the end of this excursion. You will report directly to me and work together to keep the other volunteers in line. Be warned, you will need to watch each other's backs, as the men you soundly defeated will likely seek revenge." As Captain Porter walked away, Jacinto turned to Jacen and said, "What a nice chap, and here I always thought them Black Warriors were donkey turds. Now Porter, he's a fine piece of work. I think I'll invite him home to meet the family." Jacen looked at Jacinto, who held a straight face as he said this, and busted out laughing. Soon Jacinto cracked a smile and joined him. The entrance to the eastern valley yawned ominously toward the group of travelers. Although it was late afternoon, the road came to an abrupt stop at the screen of scraggly trees that marked the entrance to the large, unexplored region. The path into the trees was dark, and Captain Porter picketed the mule to a post within reach of a small spring. The rest of the men were given orders to secure their travel packs and prepare to push into the dark trees in 5 minutes. Jacen got together with Jacinto and discussed the upcoming venture. He had come to enjoy the brownskins man's easy personality in the last day they had traveled together, and had helped protect the man when one of the fighters from before had tried to corner him with a knife. Jacinto had put up both his hands as the initial tall fighter had pulled out a dagger and pushed toward him. Jacen had snuck up behind the man and had hit the dagger out of his hand with his staff weapon. The dagger flew into the forest, and the man grabbed his hand in a cry of pain. Jacen got right up into the man's face and said, "If you try that again, I'll cut your hand off." The man sneered at Jacen, and the young fighter pulled out his own dagger and held it to the man's cheek until it drew blood. "Do you hear what I'm saying, shit breath?" Jacen demanded, holding his dagger at the man's face. The man nodded, and Jacen pushed him roughly away. The man straightened up and walked slowly away, not looking at Jacen or Jacinto. Jacen slid his dagger into its scabbard, and Jacinto walked over to him. "Thank you, my friend. I think Mr. Tall and Ugly there has it in for me. Now he'll have it in for both of us. Watch yourself, eh?" he said. Jacen nodded, and Jacinto walked away. 5 minutes later, Porter gave the command to move out, and the group pressed into the dark trees. Jacen walked in silent communication with Vale, who maintained her disguise and walked nearby. Jacinto was within view of Jacen and pressed forward with the remaining mercenary volunteers following up the rear. Porter and his men pushed forward at the point of the formation. Everyone had a weapon drawn as they moved through the strangely quiet and dark forest around them. All they could hear was the sound of their footsteps and breathing and the light scraping of armor as it moved on the bodies of the men. They walked for 10 miles and stopped to take a break and drink of water. Jacinto moved over to Jacen and said, "Nice day for a walk, I'm thinking." Jacen grinned, and Jacinto smiled at him and moved off into the nearby trees to relieve himself. Jacen was in the process of taking a drink of water when suddenly Jacinto gave a great scream. Jacen rushed over in the direction and found Jacinto leaning up against a tree on the ground. He had a terrible wound in his side and blood ran from his mouth. Jacen knelt just as the others came running over. Jacinto was still alive and was struggling to breathe and speak. After a moment, he gave a great sigh and stopped moving. He stilled entirely, and Jacen closed his eyes. Jacen turned and looked at the tall man who had accosted Jacinto earlier in the day. The man had a small grin on his face and looked back at Jacen. He smiled back at the man as he stood up from Jacinto's body and said, "Soon." The man's grin faded from his face as Jacen turned and began gathering rocks together. Porter ordered the armor stripped from the body, and after a short time, Jacen had covered Jacinto's form with the small boulders and had erected a tiny wooden sign with Jacinto's name scrawled upon the wood. The night came upon them, and Porter gave the order to set up camp for the night. He called Jacen over to him, and the two men walked the perimeter of the camp. "I don't want any more trouble between you and the other mercenaries," he said as they walked. Jacen nodded and said, "I promise I won't be responsible for any more trouble." Just then a scream rent the air from the direction of the camp, and Porter and Jacen rushed over in that direction. The tall man from before was lying on the ground and had been stabbed in the face with his own dagger, and his neck had been twisted at a gruesome angle. Porter looked over at Jacen, who shrugged and held his hands out. He had been with Porter at the time of the killing and was clearly not responsible. The rest of the mercenaries rushed up along with the other black warriors and saw the man's dead form lying on the ground. Many of the mercenary volunteers looked up at Jacen. Porter saw the exchanged looks and stepped over to stand by the dead body. "Jacen was with me when this man was killed. I don't know what's going on, but from here on out, I want all hostilities toward each other to end. If one more person is murdered, then no one will receive their pay at the end of this week. Is that understood?" Porter inquired in an authoritative tone. The volunteers muttered their agreements, and everybody moved out. For the second time that day, Jacen gathered stones and had soon buried the dead man. As he finished the job, he looked up to see Vel watching him from a few yards away. Within his mind, he heard her blow him a kiss. Jacen slept soundly that night, secure in the knowledge that Vel would watch over him and alert him of any danger. Apparently no one tried anything, and he awoke refreshed the next morning. After a short meal of rations, the group donned their gear and set off deeper in the eerie forest. They walked for several hours and eventually came to a large stone quarry that gleamed with ore. Porter excitedly stopped the group and ran to one of the rocky outcroppings of stone, where he reached out and picked up a heavy stone. Bringing it back to the group, he smashed the rock with another one until large flakes of the ore were broken away from the stone. Porter carefully placed the sample of ore into his travel pack and gave orders to his black warriors to measure the quarry. He and the mercenary volunteers set up camp while the remaining soldiers went about their tasks. It was nightfall when two of the black warriors came running back to the campsite. One of them had a large head wound and was missing his helmet. The other was fully armored and helping to carry the injured soldier. Porter ran up and took the man from the armored soldier and ordered a report. The other warrior was breathing heavily and gave a breath-filled report of what had happened. He and the injured soldier had set out with the other 8 remaining platoon members to measure the scope of the quarry. They had been set upon by 30 or 40 natives who had quickly overcome the group. He did not know if the rest of the men had been killed or taken, but had fought his way out of the location seeking aid. The mercenaries listened to this grim news with Porter, who stood up and faced them. "We will leave in 5 minutes to reconnaissance the area and find out if the other men were killed or captured. If they were captured, we will regroup and figure out a rescue. Kill anyone you encounter before they alert their kind of our presence," he ordered to the group of mercenaries. The men had taken off their travel gear and freed their weapons from scabbards. Jacen gave Vale his borrowed short sword and held his staff in one hand and dagger in the other. The staff weapon began vibrating subtly as he harmonized his will with it. The group set off with the returning soldier leading the way back. After they had walked around the left-hand side of the quarry, they were suddenly surrounded by the sounds and shrieks of attacking forest dwellers. It was difficult to ascertain where the attackers were, but several ran towards the group to engage in toe-to-toe battle. Jacen deflected the attacks that were aimed at him and used his staff and dagger with deadly accuracy. Vale protected his side and maintained her disguise and used the borrowed sword as a less effective means of defense than her usual method of fighting. The mercenaries were tough men and no one went down as they were attacked. The black warriors were prepared this time, and their superior armor and weapons were able to give them the upper hand against the attackers. The fight went on for some time, and eventually the last attacker fell. Porter breathed heavily as he scanned the area. Only one of the mercenaries had been killed in the fracas, but the rest of the bodies upon the ground were forest dwellers. He ordered them to move on in search of the other black warriors. Eventually, they found the bodies of 2 of their men. 4 were still unaccounted for. Searching the surrounding forest, they eventually found the remaining men tied up and unconscious in a group of young saplings. Porter and the other 2 warriors with him cut them free and roused them with water from a canteen. The men had been stripped of their armor and weapons, which were found piled nearby. The warriors donned their armors and picked up their weapons, and Porter gave the order to move out. They quickly marched away from the quarry back to the nearby campsite where everyone regrouped to catch their breath. Porter set up sentry duty and told everyone to rest for 4 hours, then they would move out back toward the main road. The time passed without incident, and the weary men rose to their feet and began the long march back to the main road. Jacen was tired and gritty from the fighting and hiking and looked forward to receiving his pay. They walked for the rest of the night and broke out of the tree line in the early morning. Their mule was still picketed, and Porter reattached the mule to the drivetrain and set off back the way they had come. At midday, Porter called for a break, and they pulled the train to the side of the road and made camp for a midday meal. Several of the mercenaries moved out into the forest to hunt and returned with a large pork beast which was slaughtered and splayed out over the fire to cook. The smell of roasting pork filled the area, and Jacen's mouth watered. After a time, large sections of the creature were sliced off and handed out, and Jacen ate his fill of the meat. Vale pretended to eat a piece of the meat, but privately wrapped it in a muslin cloth and put it into Jacen's travel pack. Jacen fell into a doze in the contentment of digestion and awoke to the sound of everyone rousing to begin marching again. He looked over at Vale in her disguised form, and she was carefully watching the other mercenaries for any sign of foul play toward her master. They walked for another 4 hours, then Porter called for the night camp to be set up. The volunteers and remaining black warriors worked together, and soon a safe camp environment was erected. Vale was hunkered down nearby at the campsite and pretended to doze while Jacen took his turn to stand guard, and Porter came up to stand watch with him. "It is terrible we have lost good men on this journey, yet the reward may yet be worth the risk we have taken," he said. Jacen nodded as the man spoke, remembering the man's excitement at finding the ore. We will likely be rewarded with the post of honor guard at the quarry if this metal is as pure as I think it is, Porter said. Jacen nodded at the man. The captain continued, We will need willing volunteers to help us maintain the post. I hope I can count on you to join us again in the future, as I will need strong fighters at my side. The man walked away, and Jacen appreciated the invitation, yet found he disliked Porter's greedy manner. The next morning, the group broke camp and continued their way. They came around a bend on the Great Road and saw smoke in the trees as if there were a fire burning. They quickly drove the mule train into the next portion of road and found themselves looking at the burnt-out ruins of a grower's village. A large contingent of black warriors roamed the area and were seen to be taking large sacks of booty away from the burning township. Just then, a tall man in black warrior armor rode up on a dire steed with two of his lieutenants flanking him on wrapped horse. Porter saluted the man as he came up. "Commander Reginald, what is happening here?" inquired Porter. The man, addressed as Reginald, looked back at the captain with contempt upon his face. "This village was fomenting revolt, so we have cleansed the village for our lord," responded the commander. Jacen looked at the man from his vantage point and noted the strange weapon scabbarded at his side. He looked up and saw one of the lieutenants looking at him. Suddenly the man directed his mount over to the commander, where he whispered into his ear and gestured at the group of mercenaries volunteers. The commander looked over at the group, then back at Porter. "What in our Lord's name is that mercenary doing, wearing the armor of the Legion?" he demanded. Porter glanced at Jacen's borrowed armor, then said, "Commander, we appointed one of the mercenaries as a trustee during our recent mission to the Eastern Valley." The commander's eyes narrowed, and he said, "And what did you find upon your mission?" Porter swallowed, then pulled out the sample of ore from his travel pack. The commander lifted his hand, and one of his mounted lieutenants rode forward and snatched the sample from the captain's hand with a sneer. The man rode his mount back to the commander and gave the sample to him. The commander looked at the ore and said, "Splendid! I will deliver the sample to Cassius personally." He gave the sample back to his lieutenant and said to the captain, "Your men are hereby absorbed into my contingent. Take your men and join in the cleansing with my other soldiers." He cantered his dire steed away, followed by his two lieutenants, and Captain Porter watched him go. Porter hung his head for a moment, then turned toward his remaining men. "Men, I want you to join in the cleansing as ordered by our commander," he said. Jacen stepped forward and said, "What does join in the cleansing entail, Captain Porter?" Porter turned to look at Jacen and said, "You will move throughout the village, kill anyone that lives, and take any booty you can carry. Is that understood?" Jacen looked at Porter, who angrily turned away and pulled out his sword. The few black warriors who were with him did likewise and began following their captain, who was walking toward the burning town. The mercenary volunteers hung back, and after a moment, Jacen took off the pieces of borrowed armor and weapons and dropped them to the ground. Hitching his travel pack upon his shoulders, he and Vel turned and walked into the forest, away from the scene of barbarism.